We're going to reconvene,
Fine. Thank you.
and we're going to have talks on strike and formation. First, Strike by Alex Gurevich, who is an assistant professor of political science in the Department of Political Science, and has taught many other places. McMaster has been a postdoc at Brown's Political Theory Project. He got his PhD in political science from Columbia in 2010. His interests focus on the history of political and economic thought, theories of freedom, work and leisure, Marxism, rights theory, etc. And then we're going to hear from Tal Lewis, who is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Brown and is perhaps best known as a scholar of Hegel, and has just published a book that I want to hold up for show and tell, because I want to read it. Just came out, Why Philosophy Matters for the Study of Religion and Vice Versa. And Tal is on leave from Brown this year, and he's at Princeton. So, without further ado, let's begin with Strike by Alex.
Okay, thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you to Adi and Ariella and Amanda for inviting me to speak today. My concept today is the strike, and there's a way in which the strike is a pretty simple concept. It's easy to define, it's a work stoppage to achieve some end, and it's obviously political. You look at sort of back in time to early history, the secession of the plebs was a mass strike that, in which they refused to perform the primary labor required of them by the Roman Republic, which was their military service, and they refused to perform it until they had their debts canceled, and eventually until they had new forms of political representation in the Republic. It's the birth of the institution of the tribune and a lot of the other classic institutions of the Roman Republic. So from the very beginnings of sort of at least Western political history, all the way until almost about yesterday, it's obvious that strikes are political. We've had strikes by Seattle public school teachers demanding not just higher wages and better conditions, but for corrections and with respect to racial injustice and disciplinary practices in Seattle public schools, strikes by University of Missouri football players to deal with racial injustice on campus. So there seems to be no mystery about the strike. It's easy to define, and it's obviously political. So what more is there to say about this in a concept of political concepts? Well, part of what I want to say, or all of what I want to say today, is that strikes are actually pretty complicated analytically and sort of when it comes to the analysis of the concept, but also to kind of to defend or to figure out what our defense of them is and where they stand morally and socially. So if you just consider the kinds of things and the way they've been described in the history of political and social thought, you have William Benbow, who was a kind of radical Chartist, who called his theory of the general strike, he titled the pamphlet, A Grand National Holiday. So strikes were these sort of days of ease, gaiety, and leisure. On the other hand, you have someone like Walter Benjamin calling strikes extortion. And you have Friedrich Engels saying strikes are preparation for social war. So they're holidays, and yet they're war. You have figures like John Stuart Mill saying that strikes are the necessary instrumentality of the free market, and in no way suspend anything about the normal operations of capitalism. And then, on the other hand, you have someone like Georges Sorel saying that strikes are the kind of mythic suspension of the everyday life of labor under capitalism and augur in a new world. So you have some of the most central figures theorizing strikes, talking about them in opposing ways. And so what I want to talk about today is sort of some of the aspects that make it difficult to conceptualize strikes. And in particular, I want to talk about three things. The first is I want to argue that strikes should be seen as distinctive forms of collective action. So they can't be subsumed under any of our other normal ways of thinking about collective action. And I'll say what those normal categories are. But I just want to defend them as a distinctive form of collective action that have to be theorized on their own. But the second thing I want to say is that what makes it difficult to theorize strikes is that the concept strikes refers to an internally very heterogeneous and sometimes mutually opposing set of social experiences and activities. So it's going to turn out that when we say a strike is a work stoppage to achieve some end, we haven't said very much. We have to say a lot more in order to know what we're really saying when we say something is a strike and what kind of strike it is. And that this ends up mattering a lot for what we end up valuing about strikes, which then will lead me to my third argument, or sort of really thing I want to put on the table for discussion, which is that when it then comes to the right to strike, it turns out that any reasonable justification, or some of our best justifications for a right to strike, lead us to defend certain kinds of practices and activities that put that right in strong tension or maybe even outright conflict with some of the other normal commitments of a liberal society, like freedom of contract, property rights, and freedom of association. And this is another thing that makes it very difficult to not just theorize, but really come up with stable, strong justifications for a right to strike and strike activities. So the first sort of piece of the puzzle is, why are strikes distinctive forms of collective action, and in what sense are they distinctive? Well, one funny thing about strikes is that there is much less theorizing done about them than other neighboring forms of collective action, like civil disobedience, revolutions, nonviolent action. And perhaps one reason is because they're seen as purely derivative. We can just subsume them under these broader categories. And one way that's done in liberal theory is to say, well, look, individual workers have a right to quit, and individual workers quit all the time, and all that a strike is just a collective act of quitting, people quitting together. But the straightforward problem with that way of thinking about a strike is that strikers don't quit the job when they go on strike. They just quit working. And not only they quit working, they don't let anyone else, or their view is that no one else should take their jobs because they haven't quit the job. So it isn't going to work to see this as a form of collective action that's just a collective quitting. It's not going to work that way. On the other side, though, there's some people who said, well, strikes are something more like mini revolutions. And they're like mini revolutions because it's just an attempt by a group to impose its will by force on someone else and meet a demand. And revolutions are just that kind of activity scaled up. But the reason that isn't going to work, despite there being some strong affinities between strike activities and mini revolutions, is that strikes and revolutions, is that revolutions are attempts to fundamentally change the rules of society by force and even by violence. Whereas in the case of a strike, in the typical case of a strike, there is no necessary connection between the strike and changing any of the rules. In fact, strikes can leave all of the normal rules of the economy perfectly in place. All that's been changed is a momentary terms of the contract. You might get some higher wages, you might get shorter hours or different hours or things like that, but you haven't changed any of the rules. So it's not going to work to think about strikes as an attempt to subsume strikes under that kind of activity. One other way we might go is to say, well, strikes are like civil disobedience. It's a species of civil disobedience, because civil disobedience are extremely socially disruptive forms of collective action, but they operate within the basic rules and moral framework of the existing society and trying to bring it closer to its basic principles. And so that sort of sounds like what a strike is, because a strike is extremely disruptive, but it still operates within the framework of that society. But the difficulty here is that civil disobedience typically is understood as an act of public lawbreaking for the aims of morally swaying those people who have committed injustice to correct that injustice. So a civil disobedience is an act where you publicly break the law in order to draw attention to that injustice, and you break the law in a way that attempts to appeal to the moral conscience of those people who are committing the injustice and change their behavior. Well, the thing about strikes is that, for one thing, they don't necessarily involve any law breaking at all. They're not inherently illegal. They're going to bring workers often in strong tension with the law, but there's nothing essentially illegal about attempting to achieve a work stoppage. And moreover, strikers are often not trying to morally sway anybody at all. They're just trying to take by force. The point of the work stoppage is just to raise the cost so high to the employer of not giving workers what they want that the employer gives in. So on the one hand, strikes are sort of, in a sense, less threatening or disruptive than civil disobedience because they don't essentially involve any law breaking. But on the other hand, because they're acts of force rather than moral suasion, there's a sense in which they're further along the spectrum of social disruption. And this is why I think one of the most common things people say about strikes is that they're a species of nonviolent social protest. So civil disobedience is sort of a special instance, and strikes are a special instance of this broader category of collective action, which is called nonviolence. And this Reinhold Niebuhr, Gandhi, Richard Gregg, Gene Sharp, even Martin Luther King, all of the famous, sort of the best-known theorists of nonviolent action, this is sort of what they say about strike. And it's a reasonable thing to say. We can sort of subsume strikes under the general things we say about nonviolent action because there is a way in which when workers refuse to work, it's a nonviolent action. They don't inherently threaten physical violence against any other individual person. They just refuse to go along with whatever injustice or wrong they have a grievance about, in the same way that other forms of nonviolent action do the same. They're sort of forms of passive resistance or things like that. The problem is there's nothing inherent in the attempt to achieve a work stoppage that means that you won't use violence. So standard forms of nonviolent action, whenever they're considered nonviolence, are understood to be consciously self-limiting about the means they're willing to use in order to achieve their end. So all nonviolence self-limits and refuses to use violence as part of its means for achieving an end. That's not the case for strikes. Strikes are often very violent, and there's nothing inherent in the idea that a strike is a refusal to work in order to achieve a work stoppage. That means you will limit the use of your means and not engage in violence. I mean, you read the history of any industrial society, and in particular the US. The United States has the most violent labor history of any of the Western industrial societies, and they were extraordinarily violent. And strikers often thought it was a perfectly reasonable, justified feature of their strike activity that they used violence against agents of the state who tried to repress or stop the strike, against scabs, who could only be prevented from taking the jobs by being physically intimidated or physically blocked or threatened, against private security forces of employers. I recently came across an account of striking miners who hired out a plane, this was in 1922, I think, to drop dynamite bombs on National Guardsmen who were protecting replacement workers. That was in the United States. Right? And a lot of strikes are organized, many of the strikes that period were organized by Civil War veterans who knew how to organize the strikers into battalions that would then protect the positions from National Guardsmen. In 1894, every state between Illinois and California was under some form of martial law during the mass strike of that period. And there's numerous examples of that. We heard about Ivy Lee and the Ludlow Massacre. And if anyone knows who Mackenzie King was, he was the PR man for Roosevelt and then became the FDR of Canada. And these were extremely violent interactions. So there's nothing about a strike that means it's nonviolent. And so it's a mistake, again, I think, to try and subsume it under that category. Which is why I want to say, and this is the first thing I want to say, is that it is a distinct form of collective action that has to be understood on its own terms as a refusal to work for the purposes of stopping production to achieve some end. And that's going to mean it's not just a refusal to work, but therefore also an attempt to prevent others from doing that work in order to stop production, in order to achieve some end. And that's just how we ought to talk about it. And it is distinct, and we can't get very much useful theorizing and conceptualizing go until we recognize that all these other categories, they're sort of neighboring, but they're not the same, and we're going to make mistakes or fail to understand what's at stake in an argument. So it's distinct. However, it is an extremely heterogeneous social experience. And so when we call something a strike, it turns out we end up describing very different, sometimes opposing phenomenon. One of the most interesting ways to see that is to look at the two words that have been used in the English language to describe a strike. So there's the strike, and then there's the turnout. The word strike comes from naval warfare. So in the early modern period, when there was a military battle between ships, when one ship had been defeated, the captain would order the sailors to strike the sails, which meant to lower the sails, publicly signal its defeat and surrender to the other ship, and that was sort of the standard practice of the time. Ships, as it turns out, were horrible places to work. The captains were essentially absolute despots. They had rights all the way up to assigning capital punishment without any procedures. And they were really unpleasant. They were poorly paid sailors. It was very violent. It was very unsatisfying. And so sailors at some point took to striking sails to protest their conditions and disable the ship and demand that they have their demands met before they would then raise the sails and let the ship continue to sail or leave the docks. And so strike is therefore associated with these extremely militant, violent confrontations between captains and the sailors, and therefore eventually all workers and their employers. And it brings to mind things like discipline, organization, violent confrontation, quasi-war between two sides. The turnout, which refers to essentially the same practice, which is workers refusing to work and trying to stop production, was actually the original word, and it's only in the mid-19th century that strike takes over from the turnout as the most common word used to describe a strike. But the turnout was something organized by colleges or unions or associations of skilled workers who would call for a turnout which meant to show up somewhere else other than work. In the same way that electoral turnout refers to people showing up. So the turnout was when workers would show up somewhere else than the workplace. And instead of going to work, they would go to essentially a public assembly that was a sort of festival. And so turnouts were cheerful leisure activities in which there was music, parades, food, celebrations, speeches. In other words, it was the suspension of the ordinary drudgery and domination and grinding routine of work. And so here, turnout refers to the experience of a strike being happy and a moment of ease instead of violent, disciplined, self-sacrificing. And so these are two central experiences. These are to be both central features, and we have them in the two words often used to describe strikes, and yet they're opposing social experiences. And there's other ways in which what we call strikes seem to refer to very different kinds of activities and experiences. So if we consider that a strike looks very different when we think of it as an isolated incident, as opposed to an event that takes place as one among a series of interdependent sequence of events that we call, say, a strike wave or a social movement. And so the character and importance and even the nature of the activity changes when we think of it as local and independent, as opposed to part of a sequence or a series of events. And how we end up evaluating and think what's important about a strike and when it's justified will look very different when we think about an isolated act versus a long sequence of events that takes place over time. And similarly, if we think about, or if we call something a strike when it's something that happens at one workplace, say a local privately owned restaurant, versus a general strike like the general strike of Minneapolis or San Francisco in 1934 or Seattle or Winnipeg in 1919. Those are both single events. One was a strike and the other's a strike, and yet these are dramatically different social phenomena, and it seems wrong to say and think what you've done is said something significant by saying you had two strikes. You had the strike of 4 workers at a restaurant, and then you had the mass strike under which Minneapolis was under quasi-occupation. And I mean, I've come across this when people try to do social science about strikes. There's always, every major time series about strikes, there's an initial there's an introduction which always says, well, we had this coding problem because Seattle 1919 counted as one, and so did this strike of 10 people 2 years later counted as one, and so there's going to be some measurement error. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not just a measurement error, this is a problem also for moral and political evaluation. And there's a number of different ways in which you can kind of point to the heterogeneity of these experiences, but the kind of most vivid illustration is the strike, somewhat unlike some other kinds of collective action, always comes with lots of adjectives. So you have primary strikes, secondary strikes, sympathy strikes, wildcat strikes, political strikes, economic strikes, mass general strikes, proletarian general strikes. And I think that the reason there's so many modifiers often associated with strikes is because of the internal heterogeneity of these experiences. Now, this isn't just something that's sort of conceptually or analytically interesting. It carries real importance for what we end up thinking is valuable and important and defensible about strike activity. Because, to sort of give an example, there's a long line of thinking that the kind of most important thing about strikes and what's to be celebrated about them is that they're non-instrumental forms of activity. They're essentially social performances. And you get that sort of in Sorel and in Benjamin and very acutely in Agamben. And there the point is precisely this sort of active refusal is the important thing about a strike. And even sort of maybe the celebratory activity of strikers. The suspension of the norm is the point, not whether it's achieved some end. On the other hand, if you think what matters about strikes is that they're supposed to achieve some very socially valuable objectives, it's one form of collective action whose point is to make society more just, then what we care about are the ends, and it's important that they're sort of militant forms of collective action, well organized to achieve their end. And if they aren't pitted appropriately to their end, who cares about the social performance, the performative aspect? That's to trivialize all the sacrifices involved in the form of collective action involved, right? It's turning defeat into victory if all you can ever say about it is, it was a lot of fun while we did it, right? So, and this is a real problem because both aspects of a strike are real features about them and ineliminable features about them. So that brings me just to this sort of third kind of conundrum, which is how then to think about the right to strike, sort of in our moral. And there are a lot of ethical issues around the strike. I'm just mentioning the right to strike here. But when we say that workers have a right to strike, and maybe sometimes that they're obligated to strike, there are a lot of different arguments you might give, but I think whatever argument you give, it's going to be something like workers have a right to resist the exploitation and domination that they tend to experience in the modern labor market and in the workplace, which means that the workers who have the best claim to exercising this right are going to be low-skill workers who are usually the least advantaged and most easily exploited. But the problem here is precisely those workers who, in order for them to actually have any chance of reasonably succeeding, of carrying off anything like a reasonably effective, or a strike that has any reasonable chance of success, it's not enough for them to stop working. They have to be able to prevent the large supply of replacement workers from taking their jobs. And the only way that they can do that, typically, is through exercising some forms of compulsion or coercion over those replacement workers. But that means that for them to exercise their right to strike, they're always going to find themselves in conflict with some of the basic rights and institutions of a liberal society. They're going to be in conflict with property rights, because one of the ways in which they can prevent, one of the few ways workers, low-skilled workers in particular, can prevent replacement workers from taking their jobs is to say, occupy the workplace, or sit in, or to prevent access to the workplace. But they can only do that if they physically prevent people from going in, and that's going to violate the employer's normal incidence of property ownership over his workplace and ability to run his or her use his or her property the way the law says he's normally free to do. It's also going to violate with the freedom of contract of all the replacement workers, since normally replacement workers are supposed to be free to make labor contracts with whoever is willing to make labor contracts with them. But again, strikers are going to exercise various forms of intimidation and coercion over them. And then finally, it will violate their freedom of association because it's forcing a large number of individuals usually to respect and follow the aims of an association that they have no control over or haven't agreed to join. And so what this means is there's kind of a somewhat, I think, unresolvable dilemma, which is that every liberal society recognizes that workers have a right to strike. It's sort of a fact about modern liberal societies. On the other hand, it's very hard for those who have the best claim to that right to exercise it in effective ways without coming into strong tension and sometimes violating the also fundamental liberal rights of other members of that liberal society. So that's sort of the third kind of moral puzzle as opposed to the two kind of conceptual puzzles. And I'll just sort of leave those out on the table for us to discuss in the discussion.
Thank you. I want to, I guess, begin by thanking the organizers very much, the Kogut Center and Amanda's.
Oh, right.
But also to Adi, to Bonnie, and to Tim organizing this. I think a special word of non-thanks to Alex for such a rhetorically brilliant presentation that I have to follow. But my treatment of the notion of formation is like Sharon's treatment of agency in that it is part of the beginning of a new book project that I'm working on, thinking centrally about notions of formation. But unlike Sharon's presentation, where I took her to be making really excellent moves in terms of delineating a particular conception of agency and how she wants to think about it, part of what I'm doing is actually trying to conceive of formation as a kind of broader frame for bringing together sets of conversations that are not usually brought together. It functions then as a kind of bridge concept, as Aaron Stalnaker has talked about the idea, where I'm interested in thinking about these different treatments as formation without yet here working out all of the disagreements or the ways in which they certainly differ as well. So I hope that will be clear as I go on. In the fields of philosophical and religious ethics, dominant narratives often describe a fundamental shift from a focus on good character and virtue to a focus on right action, where ancient and medieval theories focused on the kind of person one should be, the virtues to be cultivated. Sometime in early modernity, according to this story, reflection on how we ought to live largely abandoned this concern with character in favor of a focus on what one should do. To use one shorthand, which we'll ultimately need to qualify, we abandoned Aristotle for Kant. This shift from who one should be to how one should act may seem subtle, but in the eyes of many entails an abandonment of attention to the cultivation or formation of character. In this respect, the modernity that results can be seen as verging on a kind of free-for-all, a situation that some judge as a kind of liberation from oppressive hierarchical traditions, and others see as a moral breakdown. One of the things I find most interesting about this family of narratives is how widely shared it is by those who celebrate this shift and those who decry it. As influential as this narrative is in a great deal of work in ethics, however, another narrative is arguably more prominent in the academy as a whole. In this narrative, or perhaps more precisely genealogy, modernity in the North Atlantic world represents not so much a liberation from oppressive hierarchies as the emergence of more subtle but pervasive forms of discipline and control. This is anything but a free-for-all. This broader account comes in multiple versions, many of them deeply indebted to the work of Michel Foucault. And to be sure, the precise nature of Foucault's account of modernity is far from obvious, and elements of his work complicate the narrative that I'm sketching here. Even without entering into those debates, however, I think the broader conception, or this broader picture, should be familiar to many of us. Right? To take just a few examples, it finds nearly canonical expression in Foucault's Discipline and Punish. We find it in Talal Assad's claim that, quote, the distinctive feature of modern liberal governance is neither compulsion, think there of Hobbes, nor negotiation, think of Locke, but the statecraft that uses self-discipline and participation, law and economy as elements of political strategy. We also find a related version in Amy Hollywood's account of the ascesis, the bodily and mental practices required by Kantian autonomy. And we see it in arguments that the emergence of free indirect discourse in the 19th century support intensified forms of self-surveillance, scrutiny, and discipline. Whereas in the first narrative, modern subjects are individuals who are, if things go well, left to their self-determining freedom, in the latter narrative, the process of subjection not only influences and directs us from without, but constitutes our subjectivity in the first place. What some imagine to be increasing freedom from restraint actually reflects a greater internalization of restraint. The notion that modernity frees us from constraints in order to be our authentic selves is thus one more result of the forces and constraints that permeate and constitute modernity, according to this family of narratives. The contrast between these two narratives is striking, as is their simultaneous prominence. Notably, the former narrative, that is the narrative of Western ethics with which I began, often largely ignores the latter, while the latter frequently goes at least some way toward giving an explanation for the existence of the former. The current work in which I'm engaged seeks to both draw upon and critique each of these narratives. I think they both contribute importantly to our understanding of the histories, constraints, and prospects that define much of the social worlds that we inhabit. Moreover, each draws attention to the ways in which character or subjectivities or selves, depending on whose vocabulary we are using, are formed and constituted. Yet the narrative about the history of ethics tends to overlook the way that particular practices continue to form particular kinds of subjects in the modern period, while the narratives associated with genealogies of modern discipline frequently flatten their treatments of the operations of power such that we can easily lose critical purchase. With these concerns in mind, I come to the term formation. I'm interested in the notion of formation as a site for thinking through the way that subjects are formed through bodily practices, ascesis, mental exercises, disciplining, conversions, modeling by others, and other practices. Formation may be imposed on us by others, or in some sense voluntarily chosen. It may be a largely conscious process, or one that is hidden to those both within and outside of the process. Formation thus provides a nexus that brings together widespread attention to practice, the body, and narrative. The point in the present context is not to settle on a single conception or account of formation, but rather to use the concept as a site of contestation. For part of what we see in thinking about formation in these contexts, both the different fields of inquiry and the different epochs, are shifts in the notion of formation, shifts that themselves exemplify broader contestation over conceptions of human life and its norms. And while prominent narratives of Western ethical thought might suggest that the crucial divide here is between modern and pre-modern notions of ethical formation, a focus on formation highlights the depths of disagreement both within ancient materials and within modern debates. Framing formation broadly in this way enables us to do several things. It brings together academic conversations that have often been kept separate despite their overlapping subjects. I am, among other things, attempting to bridge discussions around ethics, which often make many people outside of philosophy and certain subfields of political science and religious studies uncomfortable, with themes and topics that have had a pervasive impact well beyond these fields. Part of the point of my intervention is to argue that the kinds of normative claims that are at home and work in ethics are already lurking in a great deal of work that may seek to avoid these implications, a point to which I'll return at the end of my remarks. In addition, a focus on formation enables us to distinguish competing and complementary conceptions of formation. Relatedly, it enables us to see ways in which attention to formation continues past this purported turn to an act-centered morality. More specifically, in ways that are central to the book on which I'm working but that I'll not really get to today, a focus on the notion of formation during the revolutionary period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries enables us to see and appreciate not merely new forms of oppressive power emerging during these periods, but also efforts to delineate a formation for a distinctly free and modern subject. I think the best way to further develop my arguments for the significance of the concept is to try to link it to histories of discussion in order to indicate how this term, formation, might capture and connect crucial elements of these historical discussions. I thus seek to elaborate the notion as emerging from this history. Doing so in this context will necessarily be cursory, but I hope that it will begin to flesh out what I mean by the term and why I might find it productive. Perhaps the most obvious place to begin, what we might mean by our formation is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle's account of formation depends very much on his conception of the soul and the role of this account in understanding the human good. Aristotle builds here on a notion of a soul consisting of both rational and non-rational parts. That part of the soul that he identifies as being reason itself, for Aristotle, corresponds to the intellectual virtues, the excellence of distinct kinds of thought. But of the non-rational parts of the soul, some, such as our digestion, seems quite inaccessible to reason. But a great deal, such as our appetites, our spiritedness, does seem to be subject to reason in Aristotle's picture, even though it's not reason itself. So that for Aristotle, virtues of character, such as courage, temperance, justice, and so forth, come in here. For these virtues consist largely in the training or forming of our appetites, emotions, desires, such that, as in the case of bravery, for instance, quote, whoever stands firm against the right things and fears the right things for the right end, in the right way, at the right time, and is correspondingly confident, is the brave person. For the brave person's actions and feelings accord with what something is worth. For Aristotle, then, our appetites, emotions, and desires are anything but given, and neither are they marginal in relation to what it means to live ethically. This training consists largely in habituation, in acting as good people act, even when we may not initially desire to do so, for Aristotle. Quoting again, for we learn a craft by producing the same product that we must produce when we have learned it. We become builders, for instance, by building, and we become harpists by playing the harp. Similarly, then, we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, brave by doing brave actions. That is, by repeatedly acting in this way, whether we do so because forced to by authorities such as our parents at an early age, or out of our own vague sense of wanting to emulate some people who we admire in some inchoate way. By doing that, by going through those motions, our appetites are molded accordingly. The process is certainly not mechanical, and Aristotle offers no guarantees. But Aristotle does think that going through these motions tends to form our desires into stable dispositions to feel the right thing to the right degree in the right situations. And this is crucial to virtue. Importantly, Aristotle's emphasis on habituation does not entail that virtue is a matter of mere habit. To the contrary, he emphasizes that genuine virtue involves acting voluntarily for the right reasons and in consciousness of these reasons. Although going through the motions may be a path to virtue, it does not constitute virtue itself. The resulting character cannot ultimately be defined in terms of an adherence to a particular set of rules or codes. Rather, in this picture, the good is defined by what the good person does, with the recognition both that human flourishing consists in possessing the virtues themselves, not simply in committing the right acts, and that no set of rules can attend adequately to all the relevant particulars. In Aristotle's picture, then, which is arguably the most prominent model of ethical formation in Western thought, formation consists preeminently in the shaping of character through repeated acts emulating what good people do. Though we could also use the term formation to talk about the process of learning through which intellectual virtues are developed, Aristotle gives less attention to that process, and it has occupied a lesser role in Aristotle's legacy for the conception of ethics as a whole. In the history of Western reflection on habituation and character formation, Aristotle casts a long shadow. Related notions of forming character through repeated practices, often emulating role models, has been crucial to the history of Christian monasticism specifically, and asceticism more broadly. Key here is remaking the self through repeated practices that work to reform our appetites, emotions, and desires. We might note then that historically we see this attention to practices of formation preeminently among thinkers, from Aristotle to Benedict in his Rule, to Ignatius of Loyola in his Spiritual Exercises, who are concerned with ethical and/or spiritual flourishing. That is, they focus on the practices that are conducive to developing the right kinds of habits. They develop their views with explicitly normative concerns, even if the accounts of habituation or formation itself might be seen as no less relevant to thinking about the formation of different, perhaps even genuinely bad characters. Notably also, their projects focus principally on the cultivation of ethical and spiritual elites, without imagining that a society as a whole would be made up of such people. Today, however, as we look around the university, it seems to me that attention to formation is arguably more obvious among bodies of literature focused on broader social and cultural analysis. While he's by no means unique in this regard, Pierre Bourdieu offers a particularly vivid exhibition of the continuities. As we've seen, Aristotle's account of formation induces us to consider closely the role of practice and practices in ethics, as well as the necessary involvement of the body in this formation, and thus in human flourishing. Bourdieu's account of the logic of practice can be seen as elaborating a closely related notion of the formation of subjects through repeated practice. Identifying what he sees as the distortion imposed by attempting to articulate practice in the objectifying language of most social analysis, Bourdieu argues that we have to, quote, look to the incorporated dispositions, or more precisely, the body schema, to find the ordering principle, capable of orienting practices in a way that is at once unconscious and systematic. Like Aristotle, then, Bourdieu contends that repeated practice transforms the subject in accord with the norms of the relevant community. While for Aristotle, these concern the body, in that we are talking about the formation and reformation of appetites and desires, Bourdieu heightens the attention to embodiment. Not only are our appetites and desires molded to conform with norms, what develops is a kind of practical sense that is fundamentally embodied. Quoting Bourdieu again, one could endlessly enumerate the values given body, made body, by the hidden persuasion of an implicit pedagogy, which can instill a whole cosmology through injunctions as insignificant as sit up straight or don't hold your knife in your left hand, and inscribe the most fundamental principles of arbitrary content of a culture in seemingly innocuous details of bearing or physical and verbal manners, to put them beyond the reach of consciousness and explicit statement. The inaccessibility to theoretical reflection is central to Bourdieu's account of practice. The point concerns both the way that the logic of practice is distorted by attempting to state that logic in theoretical terms, and that the practices only function as they do by virtue of not being made explicit. Right? We might think, for instance, that a gift economy would be undermined if we made explicit the demand for reciprocity that seems fundamental to it. Right? My point here is not to summarize Bourdieu's account of practice, but to point toward the centrality of formation to that account. Nor do we need to sort through here the combination of commonalities and divergences between the accounts of formation in Aristotle and Bourdieu to begin to see that they offer overlapping yet differing notions of the formation of the subject. If a great deal of social theory, particularly in its attention to practice and embodiment, can be seen as intersecting with or sharing Aristotelian concerns with habituation and formation, major developments in modern Western ethics are frequently seen as having gone in a very different direction. Between Aristotle's account of ethical formation and Bourdieu's account of the incorporation of dispositions to constitute practical sense, Immanuel Kant famously, though obviously not single-handedly, shifted the locus of conceptions of morality from the cultivation of good character to a notion of right action grounded in genuinely moral motivation. Crucial to Kant's conception of morality is the idea that in order to be morally praiseworthy, an act must be motivated by duty, which requires that we would so act regardless of whether our appetites or desires or other kinds of inclination inclined us toward that act. Underlying this claim is a very different conception of human action. As powerful as our appetites and desires may be, they are not themselves sufficient to explain our actions. Rather, we only act on these insofar as we adopt them or take them up. Our desires are in no sense determinative of our action. As with classic Stoic accounts, this model of agency places the onus of morality on a will that is understood as independent of particular appetites, desires, loves, and other inclinations that I happen to experience. Insofar as I allow those factors to determine my action, I am unfree, acting heteronomously rather than self-determining or autonomous. While Kant's precise account continues to be disputed in the secondary literature, and the character of the difference between the freedom involved in this picture and in Aristotle's needs much further scrutiny, even a brief account points to a significantly different role for and conception of formation in the Kantian picture. If we need not act on those appetites and inclinations, no matter how strong they are, then the formation and reformation of those inclinations is dramatically demoted ethical significance. To be sure, I actually take Kant to have a more complex view of these issues than this sketch alone suggests. Attention to materials such as his rarely read lectures on pedagogy, for instance, reveals greater ethical significance for the formation of appetites and desires than much of Kant's legacy would suggest. Nonetheless, this arguably flattened reading of Kant places in relief an alternative conception of ethics or morality, and one that appears to substantially diminish the role of formation. Vividly highlighting the contrast, the contemporary Kantian Christine Korsgaard has critiqued renewed interest in virtue theory in the following terms. Quote, "Some recent virtue theorists have offered us the, to my mind, equally rebarbative picture of the virtuous human being as being a sort of good dog, whose desires and inclinations have been so perfectly trained that he always does what he ought to do, spontaneously and enthusiastically, with tail-wagging cheerfulness." For Korsgaard, to place the focus of morality on forming the right kinds of appetites and habits is to aim for well-trained pets, which fails to do justice to human freedom and dignity. While I've introduced critiques of what we might think of as classic models of formation by focusing on Kant's moral theory, the latter is so significant precisely because of its imbrication with broader intellectual, social, and political developments. Broadly Kantian notions of self-determining freedom are often seen as conceptually and historically undergirding the so-called autonomous individual of modern liberalism. No less importantly, suspicion of more traditional models of formation is closely connected to criticism not only of the particular social hierarchies in which the corresponding visions of good formation were embedded, but also with the inevitable role of authority in any ethical picture in which good judgment is only achieved through a disciplining by the proper practices. More broadly, concerns with sincerity, authenticity, and freedom, each of which has been conceived along various lines, have appeared to stand in deep tension with an emphasis on formation, particularly when conceived in terms of habituation and the emulation of models. Now, for someone championing the import of the concept of formation, I'm actually sympathetic to key elements of these critiques. I worry about the way that models of virtue have been closely intertwined with oppressive social hierarchies and have served to rationalize privilege and domination. I worry about the way that this continues to occur in the contemporary academy and beyond, and I'm critical of the way that many recent champions of virtue and character as the key to ethics implicitly and/or explicitly call for a return to pre-modern models of human excellence without attending to the inequalities and domination embedded in those forms. Though I imagine some of those discussions are more prominent in the study of religion than in many of the other disciplines represented here. Nonetheless, I want to argue that a failure to attend to various dimensions and senses of formation will leave us unable to account for and defend just those concerns with oppression, power, and emancipation. That is a major reason for my larger interest in attending closely to formation. Along these lines, a number of scholars have recently challenged what they see as modern liberalism's claims to reject the kind of formation that is associated with tradition in general and religious traditions in particular. I have in mind, for instance, Talal Assad's interrogation of what he calls formations of the secular. As a kind of sidebar here, let me note that Assad's use of formation points to the term's ability to refer not only to the action of forming, but also the kind of precipitate and result of practices in both informal and formal institutions. And even though I'm focusing in my comments principally on this first sense of formation, that is the action of forming, the connection to the second closely connected sense is part of the term's appeal to me. But the paper's too long already, so I didn't go there here. Right? Amy Hollywood builds on Assad's work as well as Foucault's distinction between moral codes and the morality of behaviors to focus on what she sees as the necessary background of autonomy. Quote, in providing the means for determining the moral laws, then, Kant provides not only a code, but also an ascesis through which moral subjects are created. Kant not only tells us how to determine the proper moral code, but the very same operation also forms us as subjects who act in a particular way and toward particular ends. For Kant, then, code and ascesis are inseparable. The form of ascesis he recommends requires detachment from the body, emotion, and desire. It entails a bodily and mental discipline by means of which the subject becomes detached from his or her body. Thus, Kant's form of ascesis, like the notion outlined by Foucault, broadens Marcel Mauss's conception of practice to include mental and spiritual exercises that affect the body, but are not generally acknowledged themselves to be bodily practices. As much as I appreciate Assad's and Hollywood's attention to the background conditions that make possible the kind of formation that is possible for the subjects that we associate with liberal modernity, I think we need to go further in two important respects. First, many of the broad brush accounts of liberalism and modernity, and here I am thinking of Assad as well as others such as Alistair MacIntyre and Stanley Hauerwas, but I don't include Hollywood in this group, credit the modern West, or liberalism, both of them in scare quotes, with only its most superficial self-understandings. They criticize liberalism for an ignorance of the practices that make it possible. Yet one can only generate this vision of modernity by ignoring, for example, Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, G.W.F. Hegel, and Emile Durkheim, to pick only a few figures who I don't think can accommodate that narrative. Reflection on formation is in fact far more integral to both canonical and more marginal figures in the history of modern Western thought than these critics, and to be fair, some of modernity's defenders contend. The second way in which I want to push beyond these figures in thinking about formation since sometime in the 18th century, however, concerns becoming more precise about the different senses of formation at issue. If we want to take seriously the variety of ways in which a figure such as Kant could contribute to our thinking about formation, we have to do more than attend to the way in which we may also find in his corpus an attention to the molding of appetites and desires that has often been overlooked. That point is important, and I don't mean to belittle it. But in addition to that move, we also need to ask whether Kant's project entails a different kind of formation, one focused not on appetites and desires, but on the development of a capacity for judgment and practical reasoning of a particular sort. The object of formation, what is molded, is thus importantly different in this conception of formation from what we started with in Aristotle. Hollywood might be seen as pointing us in this direction, but she doesn't go far enough in trying to tease out these various kinds of formation. Thus, it's not enough to suggest that in addition to Kant's focus on practical reason and the categorical imperative, there is also another dimension to ethics, nor is it enough to argue that acting autonomously out of the motive of duty alone requires some kind of tamping down of appetites and desires. Rather, it will also require a kind of formation that differs not with respect to the kinds of emotional responses that it cultivates, but with respect to the molding of our judgment rather than our appetites. What exactly this means is something I see myself as still very much working through, both in relation to Kant and others. It will concern developing our capacity to reason. Perhaps it has a great deal to do with our capacity for critical thinking. And importantly, with respect to the models of formation with which we began this discussion, it may not involve the body to the same extent or in the same way, and it may have a very different or perhaps even more limited role for repeated practice. To be clear, though, my point here is not to argue for this model of formation, much less for its adequacy on its own. Rather, in the present context, my point is simply to argue for a broad notion of formation within which we develop as much precision as possible regarding different particular conceptions of formation. Bringing together this interest in distinct models of formation within the history of ethics on one hand, and attention in a broad range of recent work in the human sciences on the pervasiveness of formation on the other, does more than provide a way of reframing the history of Western ethical thought. By drawing attention to extensive work on formation that is explicit about its normative engagement and commitments, bringing these analyses into a conjunction with each other simultaneously points toward the ethical entailments or entanglements of a great deal of work that rarely presents itself as making normative ethical claims. That is, as someone who identifies as frequently working in areas called religious and philosophical ethics, one of the things I find striking in a good deal of recent literature from across the humanities and social sciences that attends closely to actual practices is that it frequently resists avowing explicitly normative ethical claims. The point is not that this literature does not make normative claims, rather it's that it frequently does so only implicitly, such as by developing critiques that call for and partly presuppose an account of what would be better. Portions of Foucault's corpus read this way, as does important work by Talal Asad, Robert Orsi, and Saba Mahmood. These materials provide invaluable insight into processes of formation operating in particular contexts. The work is frequently animated by criticism of oppression and domination, and does much to uncover their subtle and not so subtle workings. Moreover, they expose the naivete of much work that presupposes simplistic models of agency, in which human agency is understood predominantly in terms of overcoming the impact of tradition in order to be able to think for oneself without realizing the extent to which independent thought is itself the result of specific practices of formation. I find Mahmoud's Politics of Piety very helpful on these issues. Nonetheless, I find that these works and that many of the discussions they generate frequently both resist claims about what would be better models of formation and resist the making of such claims by anyone else. That resistance, particularly the latter form, seems to me to lack justification. The critique of one set of practices, implicitly or explicitly, depends upon criteria by which practices are judged better or worse. By virtue of its critiques, then, this literature explicitly or implicitly raises questions regarding what would constitute better practices of formation. Importantly, responses to this question might be of many different sorts. While some might attempt to ground their answers in what they take to be universal conceptions of reason, of natural law, and/or of human nature, many others will not. One might, for instance, argue for better forms of ethical formation through immanent criticism of existing practices, and even such immanent criticism can take many forms. Thus, it's important not to conflate calling for an acknowledgement and at times defense of explicitly normative ethical demands with a call for a universal ethical standpoint grounded in pure practical reason, in natural law, or in some other equivalent. The latter are only some of the possible ways of doing the former, that is, of making ethical normative claims. I emphasize this point because I suspect that the impasses we sometimes reach in interdisciplinary discussions are caused more by terminological confusion about what we mean by normative claims than by intellectual differences. To be clear, my point is certainly not that all of these authors should always be developing explicitly normative ethical claims, nor am I calling for everyone to abandon the kinds of work they've been doing and become ethicists. I certainly believe strongly in a division of academic labor, both within the work of an individual as well as across and between individuals. But what I am calling for is the recognition that the kinds of normative ethical claims that I have in mind, claims about different types of formation being better and worse, and yes, clearly part of what we'll debate is how to cash out better and worse. but that these claims are of a piece with the attention to practices of formation that is so widespread in the academy. Ethical claims about how we ought to live, whether that we is defined expansively or more narrowly, are solicited and often presupposed by just this body of material. Attention to formation and its significance across these discourses helps to illuminate this point. Thank you.
So the floor is open for these two really terrific and talks that were really different in genre, although I can think of a lot of crossovers, and I'm very eager to hear people's views about all that. So I have Sharon, William, Timothy, Amanda, and James, and Lucas, and Mon. Sorry. Okay, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you guys for these wonderful papers. There's so much to talk about in both of them. I'm just going to limit myself to basically one question for each of you. For Alex, I think the tension that you described in your third point about the right to strike and other liberal rights is important, but I wonder, maybe it's not as deep a tension as it might seem if you think about the ways in which the kinds of freedom the kinds of rights that are clearly in tension with the right to strike are already recognized as being limited in important ways. The right to property, I have the knife, I can do what I want with it, but I can't stab you with it, So the right to property is constrained already, and the right to freedom of contract, maybe there are reasonable ways to understand the limitations on that right. I didn't catch the third one.
Freedom of association.
Freedom of association. Anyway, so maybe the tensions aren't so, fundamental as it may seem, and maybe thinking about balancing them is just yet another thing that has to be, or set of goods and rights and values that have to be balanced in a liberal or democratic society. So what about that? And then for Tal, I'm so sympathetic to this, to your project of formation, and also to the kind of dissatisfaction and frustration you have with the way in which so much work in contemporary political theory is resistant to avowing its own ethical purposes or itself as an ethical project. When you started talking, I was thinking, just because of the concept, I was thinking about social formation, and maybe because it was paired with Alex, I was thinking about social formation in the way that you talked about it in connection with Talal Assad, I think, in terms of social groups and institutions and things that bring about strikes, so the things that people strike against and so on. So I wanted to ask you to just say something about how the formation of selves, how you see that as being connected to social formations in this more collective sense, as kind of, on the one hand, the mechanisms through which selves are formed, but also as the kind of, as setting up the ends or purposes for particular kinds of formations of selves. Like, just thinking about Foucault, the modern self as disciplined for particular purposes, the docile subject of the modern state, the efficient worker of the modern, capitalist economy and so on. So I would just be interested to hear you say more about how these two aspects of formation are connected in your mind.
So thanks for that question, Sharon. I didn't really have a chance to explain quite the sense in which I thought there was a strong tension between the right to strike and these other rights. So the reason that we can't solve the problem by saying, well, all rights are restricted in some way. Rights get restricted so that everyone can enjoy equal rights. They also get restricted in order to guarantee even more fundamental and important values, like I don't have a right to use my property to kill you or to harm you. So those are all perfectly justified restrictions on exercise of the rights. But my point about the right to strike, especially when it's exercised in the particular ways I described, is that it goes further. It ends up violating the rights of others. And I think distinction between a restriction and a violation is a violation is when you interfere with the exercise of a right in central range of application. So the difference between strikers taking over a factory and preventing the employers from deciding when it's going to be operated or not, the difference between that and me using my knife to strike you is no one thinks that the central reason why we have property rights is so that I be free to harm people. Whereas the central reason we have rights to private property and rights of private property and productive assets is so that those who own it have total discretion over what economic uses it's going to be put to. And so the point about a strike is that it violates or it interferes with the exercise of that right in its central range of application, not just with any of the standard restrictions we think are normal to any incident of the exercise of the right. So that's why I think it's not just to recognize that we always restrict rights, that we actually end up saying that the right to strike is either going to be a right that protects an interest that's even more fundamental than the interest protected by the right to private property, depending on the new law, which is that it just sounds like we don't have a good argument anymore for having those rights of private property. That doesn't sound very liberal. Or we're going to say we've just recognized two rights that are in pretty profound tension with each other, because the exercise of one is going to interfere with the central range of application and exercise of that right, not just with the normal and acceptable restrictions.
Thank you very much for the question. It's kind of an invitation to think and talk more specifically about the other side of the formation. And when I initially chose the topic of formation, part of my reason for the interest in the term is precisely that duality between both individual, sort of thinking about the formation of the individual, but also thinking about the, again, I think of a kind of solidification or reification of social practices in particular kinds of institutions. So coming back to sort of formation broadly, I think about it very much as something that occurs through social practices, and talking about social formations as a way of talking about the way in which those practices are not merely individual practices, but they are broader shared practices that create both sort of shared ways of doing things as well as the actual institutions that enforce them, whether through various kinds of laws, policing property rights, or these kinds of issues. But I think part of what I also like about formation is it gives us a sense of the ways in which sometimes we are quite conscious of these social practices, of these social formations, and yet much of their work is done in ways that are hidden from us, right? And I think there's a lot more to be said on whether they are necessarily hidden and which ones can be brought to consciousness and which ones cannot. But the way in which social practices and the practices of formation tie together processes through which we think about how we comport ourselves in a seminar setting like this, what kind of respect we owe to others in situations of strikes, the entire sort of our political engagement and other kinds of public political activities. And I think the focus on formation connects with the way in which each of those are deeply shaped by various kinds of social practices that are interconnected. So it sort of feels more like a yes, and then cashing it out in particular ways for particular situations.
And I suppose, well, I want to go to the next question, but I suppose one of the issues would be, of course, that relation.
Please use the mic.
Sorry. I suppose to get some friction going between the talks, one question to be raised as we go along might be that in a society in which there are conflicting formative processes, how that actually works and how that may complicate the analysis. William.
Thanks to both of you for those great talks. My questions are mainly for Alex, but I just want to say to Tal, what you were saying about Bourdieu is of great interest to me. I have something fairly brief, but to say about Bourdieu in my talk tomorrow, so I was taking notes. I probably should. So Alex, two things. One, I was very struck by how long it took you to say the word union in your talk. It came, and interestingly, it came in the second section when you were addressing the question of the heterogeneity of the concept of the strike. And I just want to take note of that and raise it, I suppose, as a question. I mean, there's at least the possibility of strikes happening without the workers who are striking being organized, but most of the time, the question of their being organized, of how they're organized, of the relationship of those organizations to the rest of society would seem to me really pivotal. And I would like to hear you talk about that a bit more. And secondly, just on the question of the right to strike, surely those rights are determined by a political and legal system of a specific kind in which the interests of different classes in society are not the same. That is, you tended to address that question from the point of view of, in a liberal society, this is what rights are, and this is the way they work, and this is the complicated and often contradictory way they come into play in the case of the strike, which leaves open still the question of how those laws are written. I don't mean only in the narrow sense labor law, but laws more generally, and that could then lead on to the question, which you also raised, but I'd like to hear you say more, of the way in which strikes within a given political legal system can often at least raise the possibility, not just of a job action that involves refusal to work and how far it can go within that system, but of taking on the system in a more fundamental way, the anti-capitalist aspect of the potential of your talk.
Thank you for those great questions. And there are things I've been thinking about, which I didn't have a chance to talk about within the timing of the talk. But on the question of unions, I keep those more, the question about strikes versus unions, I keep more separate than we might tend to think, because for one thing, a lot of strikes are called against the wishes of the union leadership, and some of the most important strikes of the 20th century, especially in the US, were basically wildcat strikes called by workers who refused to go along with the kind of political conservatism of the union leadership. And there's a lot of arguments for unionization that have nothing to do with striking. And so I just think that they end up being somewhat different. We are talking about groups of workers, organized workers, but that's slightly separate from saying, well, we're talking about unions first and then strikes. Second thing is a lot of strikes historically have been strikes in order to win recognition for unions. And so the strike comes first and then the union comes second. And these days in the US, I would say a lot of strikes, or I'd hope that at some point a lot of strikes end up being strikes against the laws regulating the ways in which unions get formed, because the laws of the United States strongly encourage the formation of very particular kinds of very conservative interest group fragmented unionization. With respect to the sort of legal and political situation of striking and the anti-capitalist undercurrents of it, part of what I was trying to get at, I was trying to do this immanently, speaking of sort of immanent criticism. I mean, in a way, you start with, we have liberal societies, which all, on the one hand, are basically capitalist and protect private property rights that create certain class relationships. On the other hand, they do recognize a right to strike. And one of the problems is, having now spent the 20th century recognizing in law, sometimes in constitutions, as in Canada, that there is something deeply exploitative and unfair about the class relationships of the society, they end up giving it legal recognition, I think, in order to control and limit it, and the nature of strikes, how they're formed, which means they end up sort of, within law, I think it's almost going to be inevitable that liberal societies are going to recognize a right and a justification for it, and then constantly produce laws that undermine precisely the kinds of activities that the argument is supposed to defend. Which means that when I say the right to strike, I'm actually talking about a right that workers claim against the state. I'm not talking about a moral right that I think should be translated into legal rights, because I think it's a right that workers claim against an already unjust legal and economic order. And so there's no reason to actually really trust the state to properly inscribe it in law. And I think that the story from the New Deal onwards is essentially the disciplining of the labor movement via legal recognition of this right. So the kind of full argument about domination exploitation would be that, that actually I'm arguing about a right that isn't a right. In a certain way, it's a moral justification that isn't quite a right if we think that all moral rights are in some sense arguments for the production of and their recognition in law.
Tim.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed both talks a lot. Actually, my question is a version of Sharon's question. I was very intrigued by that moment, Tal, where you referred to Tal al-Assad and the two formations of formation, and particularly that you claimed that the second notion of formation as the result is as much an interest of yours as the idea of the act of formation, which I take you to be talking as much about Bildung and culture. I mean, there are a number of different terms that you could have been using, and it was very interesting that you chose the term formation. But I guess my reading of your paper up until that point was that, in fact, your entire analysis is really, at the moment, it seems to me, inhospitable to that Assadian notion of formation, because he seems so much more Foucauldian. By formation, I think he means dispositif, he means apparatus, he means it's essentially a disciplinary idea, and I don't see really how you can incorporate a notion of formation as dispositif, which would seem to want to account for the very formation of the individual or the formation of the subject as part of that essentially disciplinary process. I don't see how you can really accommodate that, and which I know sounds more like a comment than a question. I think it's partly I've also been thinking ever since Suzanne asked her question about the subject in response to both Sharon and James's talk, that in fact subject is this highly I mean, it's a very different concept, but it's doing very different work in relationship to discourse than the terms around agency and that were coming out in the earlier discussion. So essentially, I mean, it's a comment really, but I'd also be very interested in you further nuancing that moment in your talk.
Great. That's a tremendously helpful comment, whether it's a question or a comment. So first I wanted to make an observation that was very interesting in the discussion of Sharon's paper. Sharon had most of her paper focusing on individual agency and had a kind of short aside of, I'm interested in collective agency, but I'm not dealing with it here. And a tremendous amount of the conversation subsequently dealt with collective agency. And there's a kind of parallel, though I don't think it's as a complete parallel, in that I talked about one kind of formation and made this aside about another kind of formation, and then both of the questions deal with the second kind that I didn't deal with. And I think there's something interesting going on there in terms of what issues and concerns are sort of a broader interest to the group. When you first started your comment and you used the language of sort of the second model as a result of the first, right? So the social formation as a result of Bildung or culture, let's use that sense.
Which is what you said.
But I want to push back against the language of result, and I might have used, if I used that, I misspoke or miswrote initially, in that I don't at all want to say that those, the kinds of institutions are simply subsequent to that initial formation. To the contrary, they're very much what do that forming. And in that sense, I see it as something more like a circular process in which we can only talk about a particular, I mean, that formation of any particular individual always happens within broader, usually multiple social formations of the sort that Assad is talking about. I would completely want to go that way. I'm not, but I suspect, and maybe not, that you're still going to resist and say nonetheless, there's a remaining tension between the notion of disciplining in someone like Foucault and what I want to claim. And I'm not convinced of that, and I'm not sure the best way to talk about it further, in that if the question is, do I want to keep some sense of a reflective subject that understands itself and has a sense of identity, and that is somehow where we need resources other than simply talking about the way in which broader social practices are working through this figure. I want to say yes, I think we want something beyond that. Does that look like a kind of, coming back to the previous discussion of where Paul was making the point about a Cartesian sovereign subject? No, absolutely not. That social formation of that subject is always already there in that subject. I want to say that very much. But whether right now or later, I would really love to talk more about what you think that does and doesn't capture.
Okay. Well, again, I'm just again trying to bring the things together. I think of the figure of Ali Laplante in Battle of Algiers. People know that movie as somebody who comes into a disciplinary subjectification through the organization of a general strike. But we'll leave that for a little bit later, perhaps. Amanda.
Okay. My question, I guess I have a quick question for Alex and then a slightly longer one for Tal, but it's very related to Tim, so I'll try to keep it brief. Alex, I kind of kept waiting for, I guess I want to say, evaluative clarification, because there were a couple of moments, or normative clarification, because there were a couple of moments where you said in that incredible diagnostic performance that you gave, that some distinction or some recognition of complexity was not interesting in and of itself, but crucial for moral and political thought. And in your last answer, I felt like you began to answer it by saying, or elaborate it, by contraposing the moral to the legal, which also seemed like the moral and the political to the legal. And maybe that's where it lies, but I kind of at the end, I wanted to say, well, strike for or against, what's your, okay. So anyway, that's my question for you. And then, and it's in the spirit of Tal's, diagnosis of pervasive crypto-normativity. Okay, for Tal. Yeah, I gotta say, I don't think formation works as a bridge concept. Okay, that would be my strongest way of putting it. Okay. So what I think is that I kept thinking as you were speaking, especially late in the paper, formation of what? Okay, of the subject, probably. But then also, what kind of formation? And very late in the paper, you said ethical formation, which was just, one way of signaling your, I would say, primary commitment to the first form of formation, which is a kind of self-cultivation. Okay, which you very interestingly are wanting to extend to forms of ethical thought that are typically seen as non-Aristotelian. That's, I'm totally down with that. Okay. But it seems to me that I think you precisely should not use the word formation when you're talking about power. Why? Because I think it I guess I just feel like you're losing precisely the ethical specificity that you want. You have a critique, and the other question too, in terms of social formation or the ways in which, institutional, social, cultural power are affecting or conditioning subjects. you know, on the one hand, you kind of want to make appeal to the ways in which certain kinds of work have implicit normative claims when they critique the way that's going on. So that seems really important. But it seems like your main commitment is to this notion of the practices of self-cultivation. And so I feel that there is a kind of, I guess I want to say that there's a kind of problematic punning going on with the word formation. And I think it's one of, I think it's one of the dangers of actually the Political Concepts Initiative, which is that the concept has to become too flexible. Now, you know, anyway, that's a strong way of putting it. But I kind of feel like the project would be sharpened, and I think it's a great project. But if you actually used a different word for formation number 2, which is sort of in the spirit of Tim's question.
Author formation number 1.
Right. Yeah. Like, I can name a couple.
I definitely want to respond. Do you want to?
The first
I've
question.
had more time to think. Yeah, that's the only reason. So thanks for that. I don't know, somehow I thought it's called political concepts, so I thought it was about conceptual analysis, so I took a lot of the normative stuff away. So the first time someone said it wasn't normative enough, so that was entertaining to me, anyway. So yeah, I mean, this is part of a broader project in which I'm giving account of, among other things, the right to strike and the obligations of workers to go on strike. And the basic argument is I think that workers have a right to go on strike in order to reduce the exploitation and domination that they're subject to as part of the normal feature of being workers in a capitalist society. The reason that matters for the reason that these conceptual moves matter that I did in that sort of second part was one thing that's going to matter in the normative argument is whether a strike's effective. Right? Because if you have a right to do something because of its ability to reduce the injustice you're subject to, then it matters whether it's effective at reducing that injustice. But what's the that and what's the effect that we're trying to analyze? If we're thinking about strikes as isolated, separate incidents, then the degree to which it's been successful or not is a question of whether they won that particular strike and its demands. Did strikers in that particular case happen to get what they wanted or part of what they wanted, or did they at least have a reasonable chance of getting what they wanted? But if part of what we think is required for strikes to be successful is for workers to develop the capacity to go on strike successfully in the future, to develop bonds of solidarity, to be able to publicize their cause and attract other people to their cause. In other words, if what we're really talking about is the effectiveness of a broader struggle and strike wave, then whether a particular strike won its formal demands doesn't really settle the issue. You could lose a strike, but still think that isn't a big problem because the point of these strikes was to start developing the capacity to actually start winning strikes. You know, nothing comes of nothing, and especially in the case of things like a labor movement, there's a huge number of defeats along the way. And you might even argue that workers are obligated to participate and go out on those strikes, even if they know there's a good chance they're going to lose that one. If what you are doing is trying to see it as part of an interconnected series of events, rather than isolated, discrete, separate phenomena, separate events. So that's one point. And another point is that if you accept the basic moral argument that I'm giving for why workers have a right to strike, then it turns out that there's an even better argument for more mass and industrial kind of strikes, strikes that are sympathy strikes, secondary strikes, general strikes, have an even stronger justification on this account than individual strikes that are purely sectoral and individual, because in those cases, they're actually doing less to challenge the very structures of domination that give rise to that justification in the first place. And that puts the argument in explicit and direct odds with all labor law. To cash it out as direct political consequence. American labor law prohibits most of those activities that we would think would be most justified if you accept this argument for the right to strike. So, to put some more normative flesh on the bones of the argument, that's sort of why those were there.
Thank you very much. This is very helpful as I am in the early stages of working through it. But your comment that it seems that I'm ultimately most interested in self-cultivation is interesting, right? In that, I mean, the relationship then between self and cultivation, it suggests that the agency there lies with the person being cultivated. And I'm no less interested, perhaps in some ways more interested actually, in those cases where the cultivation or the formation happens without any desire, consciousness, or anything else of the person who's thereby formed. And I think one of the ways of maybe making some of these issues more vivid is thinking about Mary Wollstonecraft. I mean, I actually find her really helpful for thinking through and thinking about many of these issues, and it may make more concrete some of what I have in mind. But as one thinks about a vindication of the rights of woman, part of what's so interesting is that certain parts of her initial argument are so connected, sound very much like Kantian claims about thinking for oneself. But so much of the project is deeply engaged in how one comes to think for oneself, right? And one essential aspect of it is we aren't just born that way. We have to learn to do that. We have to be formed or educated in order to be able to think for ourselves. Part of the problem today, as she's writing this, she argues, is that the kinds of formation that are going on are often very bad formation, right? And so the most obvious ways of thinking about this are in terms of the kind of education of women that's happening. Part of that has to do with the misconceived notions of the virtue of modesty that are being instilled in people. She has this great line that people have heard me quote a number of times, where she talks about women being too engaged in their needlework. And the problem is that their thoughts follow their hands, right? With that idea that when their physical activity is occupied with the triviality, as she sees it, of these fashion designs, they are being distracted from and being misformed, so they don't think about the appropriate kinds of things. She talks interestingly about different professions and the role, particularly of the military and the clergy, as two professions that form people not to think for themselves. But the answer or response to that for her is not to get rid of formation. It's to come up and develop better forms of formation. And part of the reason that I want to keep power in there, or that I don't want to say that this is something different from what's happening with power, is not only her attention to the role of power in misformation, but she's also very aware, I mean, particularly when she's talking about education and the education of small children, that there's an irreducible element of authority there. And she's very specific about the ways in which when you're teaching children, when you're not letting children act on their own, on what they think they ought to do, that you have to explain to them that I'm only forcing you to do this as a way to strengthen your reason until you are strong enough to think for yourself on these kinds of things, right? She also talks, I mean, the issues of embodiment are so vivid, and just things like having children dress themselves rather than being dressed by others. And I take her to be making very strong claims about the interweaving of the kind of being able to do things for yourself physically, being able to think for yourself. And part of what's so striking to me is that it does seem to me that there's an acknowledgement of an inevitable role for formation imposed by power, by certain kinds of authority figures, particularly thinking about parents and teachers in some of her work, that as much as it's a formation for freedom in her work, there's still power going on there, and I think the kind of connections between that and what is happening in other kinds of power analysis are crucial, particularly because the kind of broader social formations and forces are absolutely central to that picture, right? It's not just what happens in the home, but what happens in the home is crucially imbricated in these broader power relations. So, I mean, I certainly want to keep talking about those things and whether that captures and gives you reason to think maybe it's worth bringing these things together or not. So,
Before going, can I get a time check from the, 10 minutes? Okay. What's that? Okay, we got a lot though. Okay, let's do two at a time, 2 by 2. James. What? I should get all of them all?
That's I'm just.
You want to do all of them at once?
Bonnie.
Well, that has been one.
Yeah, one way to go is just collect them all.
All right. We're going to collect all of them.
And then they can answer them.
All right, James.
Okay, then this is for Tom and exclusively for Tom, and I apologize. I thought I understood what the paper is about perfectly, but then I was translating it back from English into German. I assumed you're talking about Bildung. So if you said Bildung instead of formation, you have a great concept. If you say formation, it does seem that there's a problem in people understanding what you're talking about. And talking about it as self-cultivation, well, we know that self-cultivation is a really bad translation that people were using for Bildung for a while until they realized there were better yeah. So what's the significance of the fact that we don't have a good English word for what you're talking about? Or did we have it at some point, maybe in the late 18th, early 19th century, and then somehow we lost it? That's it.
Okay. Lucas.
Okay, my question is for Alex. I was just going to invite you to kind of think about the relationship between the concept of strike and two others, one of which you mentioned, the other one you did not. So the first one that you did not mention is war. And the other one which you did mention is revolution. And you characterized, you made the point that people often think of strikes as kind of mini revolutions, and there's reasons why that's, you think that's not a satisfactory way of thinking about it. I'm wondering what might happen if we think of them as temporary revolutions rather than mini revolutions. So the idea being not to kind of change the rules of the game, but rather suspend them or change them temporarily in order to induce what you might describe as a kind of Rawlsian moment, right, where a kind of Rawlsian moment, right, where the kind of inertia of modern capitalism is interrupted, such that a reshuffling of the balance of power can take place, and then the regular rules of the game are reinstated, but with the power relationships having been at least partially shifted. Yeah, so that was my question.
Bonnie.
Add Joan to the list too.
What's that?
Has had her hand up for a while, also just to add her to the list.
Use the mic.
Oh, where's the mic? Sorry. Okay. So briefly, Alex, you mentioned the two different views of strike. The one that says what's important about them is the no, the non-instrumental one, which is the Sorel, Benjamin, Agamben view, and then the one that's the well-organized instrumental one, and expressed your preference for the latter. And I'm just wondering, I've been thinking about this myself also in a different context, and I'm wondering if it might not be interesting to think about why these two might need each other instead of thinking about, well, I have to pick between them. And one possible answer to that question would be that that view of narrow instrumentality, which we associate with the second view, might also be the undoing of the strike. In other words, if strikes are only instrumental, then the people who are participating in them are calculating instrumentally, and that, of course, poses a collective action problem eventually. So when we supplement the second view of strike with the first, in which there's a certain pleasure to being in concert with others, and there's an enjoyment of the suspension of the calculative, that provides a kind of solution or alleviation of the collective action problem that is caused by the instrumentalism you want to endorse for strike purposes. But that presupposing and requiring each other might be an interesting, I don't say that Sorel and Benjamin necessarily think about it like that, but I don't know why they should force the choice on you. Maybe you know why that you want the choice forced on you. I don't know. And then for Tal, I have some other questions for you, Alex. I'll save them for later. But Tal, I'm wondering, why wouldn't you argue that Kant is a theorist of character? You just stopped short of that. I think there are grounds for it. The lectures on ethics would be Exhibit 1. The examples that he gives in the Metaphysics of Morals and the Elements of Justice is another. So I think at some level there's this question underneath your question. I don't mean it just as a historical question, although it'll sound that way. But why have people been misreading Kant for so long, as if there is this opposition between Aristotle and Kant? Is it a late modern rationalist approach that reads selectively? Is it because of a historical approach that there may be a story about on the second critique rather than on the first or the third? At some level, I think I once had a view about this, and I don't know what my view is anymore. I'm quite curious to hear yours. Those are my questions. Oh, I don't know. Is Joan next, or who's after me?
Last to our Audie and Joan.
Oh, okay.
Joan and
Okay.
I have this heavy thing, so. My question for Tal, thank you both very much for your papers. I really enjoy them. And my question for Tal is, why is St. Augustine absent in your, from this paper? It seems that, I guess in your talking about formation and the real perplexities of formation, I kept thinking of the Confessions. And Augustine, on the one hand, is sort of, this is an intellectual search going on throughout the first half of the Confessions for sort of the, some kind of rational understanding of truth. And then his conclusion that really desire is at the heart of morality. And then he has this, the big question is, how do you redirect your desire? Because for him, it wasn't getting rid of desire, but desiring the right things rather than the wrong things, and desiring them. The eroticism of the desire wasn't the problem. It was the object that you desired that was the problem. And so he has to figure out, how do I redirect my desire? But when he writes about his childhood, he also tells these very disturbing stories about, except not disturbing to him, about the way in which his nurse would withhold water from him as a child to get him used to disciplining his desire. And so I think that it's just such a rich text for grappling with a lot of the questions that you're raising. So I guess that's my question for you. Where is Augustine? And then for Alex, I thought you were going, when you first began to speak, I thought you were going to end up really challenging the right to private property. And you never quite got there. So that in a way, the paper, I think this is a danger, maybe you don't, but it seems that it's in danger of remaining sort of safely within liberal parameters, so that the problem is you've got these two rights and they clash, in liberal society. But from a more left-wing perspective, the right to private property is the right that has to be really challenged, because capital, at least capital, productive property is accumulated dead labor, unrewarded. And so strikes are, a rightful attempt of workers to, depending on what the strike is for, but to try to control more of the labor process and to get some of that surplus back for themselves. But you never quite got to the point of challenging the right to private property. And I guess I wondered where you stood on that.
Adi.
So I'll continue with the question to Alex. First, let me add a type of strike that you have not mentioned. I would like to call it the bureaucratic strike. The new union send orders, the members obey, no one is really interested, but because of some power dynamics within the union and between the union and the company, there is a strike. This is the most annoying strike, the most boring strike, and the one that exemplifies the importance of the strike that you try to marginalize or to understate, which is the performance. The strike, the festivity, the stopping work and doing something else somewhere else in order to experience a different form of being together. And you're right that if this doesn't lead to anything, it may be questionable, but maybe the thing that it leads to is precisely this experience of a different kind of being together. And to this, I would like to add something about the relations between all the different types of strikes that you mentioned. I think that the important point and the missing link there was the term potentiality. The strike potentiality. The strike is non-violent, but violence is potentially violent. It is instrumental, but it is potentially non-instrumental, or vice versa. All these are potentially in the strike itself. And this is why it is so dangerous or so frightening to those who try to constrain it.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So how much time do I have to respond? Because I don't want to,
Well,
2 minutes.
each.
2 minutes. Okay. So let me just say something, since a number of people have brought up this point about enjoyment being, I'm demoting enjoyment. So the reason for, and you're right, I think I've sort of put too much weight on dismissing that form of argument, because the way in which one tends to find it in arguments about the strike is to celebrate strikes as purely non-instrumental forms of action. What's great about them is the social performance itself, which then means there's really nothing in the writing to be able to distinguish between the strike as one of these carnivals that just reproduces society, the moment of temporary suspension that's necessary as a form of social release that actually supports the system of domination. Be able to distinguish that kind of activity from one in which from a form of social power that's able to actually challenge the existing rules or carries the potentiality to challenge the existing rules of society and actually seeks to attain some ends. And what happens in those arguments then is that it ends up trivializing the enormous sacrifices that workers often end up making. If you watch this documentary by Barbara Koppel about the Hormel strike, this was a long, difficult strike. It involved a lot of dances and parades and festivities, but they lost at the end. And they all, I mean, they were devastated. It was total destruction of that community. Half of them had to leave and travel and they lost, part of the loss was that they lost the ability to be together anymore because half of them had to emigrate to other parts of the U.S. Emigrate, you know. That's where they were. They emigres from the strike. So you're right. We have to find a way of putting it together. And I think part of it is to ask, what is it that is enjoyed? One of it is just the experience of leisure. And here I wanted to actually sort of, something I want to say to Tal is that I noticed in the discussion of formation, work doesn't, I mean, we're talking about embodiment, practices, formation of habits, desires, but work is like the central activity of modern social theory, the theory of formation. And part of what strikes have often been about is not about higher wages or lower, fewer hours, but just the release from the unbearable routines to which workers are subject and stultified. Marx quotes Smith when he wants to talk about the stultifying and damaging habits that are inculcated by engaging in certain kinds of work. So what I do need to work into the argument is precisely part of what's positive and important about enjoying the strike isn't just the political aspect of enjoying the practice of experiencing this collective social and political power, but also in the which it affirms a kind of new value for the social conditions under individuals should form themselves. What's enjoyed then is the leisure for its sort of relationship to self-creation. And for that reason, I should actually say to Joan that on this, I'm a Marxist, not a Proudhonian. So the problem with exploitation is not centrally that there's a whole bunch of value that workers don't get back but have some right to, but rather it's the actual harm to human beings that is the central characteristic of capitalist exploitation. So he doesn't think that workers have a right to the full value of their product because he thinks that's itself a myth of private property. That the deepest, most central harm of modern capitalist exploitation is precisely the deformation, the damage it actively does to human beings as self-creating beings full of potentiality. And that'd be something I'd want to add to the strike, and maybe the way to do it is to the points that Bonnie and Ali have said with respect to weaving back in the positive, celebratory aspects of the strike. And sorry, Lucas, on war, I should just say that there's an aspect of this project which is pointing out that just war theory can be pretty useful to thinking through some of the questions about when strikers may use violence, because it's very similar. And in fact, one of the few works in political philosophy on the strike basically does that, says strike's a form of just war theory. The right to strike should be understood through just war theory.
Great. Thank you. I will try to be brief, but there are so many things there. First, just briefly on the issue of work, I could not agree more. I have one of the few things I published related to this actually is a piece on work as formation in Smith, Wollstonecraft, and Hegel. That, I mean, the opening of The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about the different character cultivated by different arrangements of labor, is absolutely crucial to this. And I think there's a broader way in which one of the reasons that I think attention to I'm going to stick with the word formation for the moment, drops out of a great deal of modern ethical thought is precisely because some of the key sites where it's happening, it's no longer happening in monasteries, for instance, in the context, in a post-Reformation context anyway, but happening at work, happening in child rearing, in early education and so forth, which are not the realms that philosophers tend to write about as much as they do a lot of other things. So that it's not a coincidence that it's Mary Wollstonecraft who runs a school, who's really one of the key figures, I think, for thinking about this. So there's a lot more on that. That segues somewhat into the question about sort of translating back from the German and why not use Bildung or something like this and sticking with the term. And I think I want to say, well, it's probably no accident that I've spent a lot more time working on German-speaking intellectual worlds during this period than English-speaking, and I'm sort of expanding the project in that way. But I think one of the ways of putting part of why I want to resist just using the language of cultivation, Bildung, or culture is those tend to have quite positive connotations, right? Those tend to be, we're talking about the good versions. And I'm no less, I'm interested in the good versions, but I'm also very interested in all this forming that goes on that is not, that we might think of as not necessarily very intentional, or at least not intended by many people. We might think is for quite bad effects, and those kinds of things. And so formation to me does have a kind of broader neutrality vis-a-vis some of those issues that for me is part of why I think it enables me to bring in some of the kinds of critics, coming back to Foucault or something, in the account of discipline in Foucault, in ways that, I worry that cultivation or Bildung might make that a little harder. I don't want to insist too much on the terminology, but that's part of my reason for seeking a broader term in that way. And I think, in terms of whether there was an English term, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and think about that. Then I just have Kant and Augustine to cover. On why not go with Kant as a theorist of character, I'm not resisting that. I think certainly in the subfields that I've been doing the most work in, there was a great deal of interest generated in the 1980s by people like MacIntyre and others about the importance of virtue, and Kant gets portrayed as the villain. Then one of the things we've seen in response to that is a great deal of work on Kant saying, no, Kant cares about virtue too, Kant has an extensive account of virtue and so forth. And I'm very sympathetic to that. What I was trying to highlight just in this specific context is to try to get a sort of distinctive sense of formation of the kind of formation of judgment or formation of practical reason that might be one element of what I think Kant might force us to think about in being more precise about different senses and kinds of formation that is in addition to the things that Kant may have to contribute in terms of the formation of appetites and desires, for instance. So it's not that I'm against that, and I meant that, but I think of it that way. I hope that helps. In terms of why the misreading of Kant, I guess I would say, it is really interesting to me thinking about the lectures on pedagogy by Kant. One of the most frequent responses I get is, oh, I haven't read those, right? And they are lectures that Kant gave that he had one of his students assemble. So they get a certain degree of marginalization by Kant himself, and yet he does have them published. He gave the lectures, and then they almost drop out completely from a great deal of the reception history. So there's this kind of two-step marginalization of attention to those kinds of issues with regard to Kant that I think is also part of the story, and explaining that as a further piece, I think. I think Augustine raises a lot of really fascinating issues. Certainly he's absolutely part of this larger story, and for a variety of different ways. I think there are other ways in which Augustine has been claimed as a figure for whom precisely the kinds of models of formation that Aristotle might epitomize, Augustine can be seen as critiquing, as exhibiting pride on the part of the person who's trying to become a better person on his own without the role of grace, right? That in certain readings of Augustine, the role of grace really undermines much of the account of formation. And yet, exactly as you're pointing out, there are other parts of Augustine that offer crucial resources for precisely these issues around formation. The term bridge concepts comes from the work of Aaron Stalnaker, who has a book on Shunzi and Augustine, who wants to argue that, contrary to many readings of Augustine, precisely in the context of the history of the study of religion, that he has a great deal to say about practices of cultivating the self. I also think of John Cashin, who is Augustine's contemporary, who's had a tremendous impact on the history within Christian contexts of thinking about cultivation, and in some ways as an alternative to Augustine. But certainly that's part of the broader history. One of the things that I do find interesting about the period that I'm talking about is I think that is the early modern period, is particularly because of the Reformation, there is a sense in which many of the discussions that had been taking place principally with their kind of principal focus as being on monastic life within much of the history of Christianity look very different than or get challenged when the monasteries are abolished and you get a kind of turn toward everyday life. So part of what's also interesting is that turn toward everyday cultivation and the question of, well, what does this mean? And I think we start getting more attention to what does this mean for non-elites, those who are working in factories, who are raising children, et cetera, in ways that I think are part of the bigger picture and story. So that's it. Thank you so much for the comments. I really am grateful. So.
All right, let's thank our speakers and go have lunch.